Well, good morning. Welcome to Eagle Christian Church. Thanks for being here with us today. If you're watching online or one of our campuses, thanks for joining us as well. My name's Jacob. I'm one of the ministers here, and we have been in the book of Genesis for a while now. We've been in here all year, and today we're covering a pretty large chunk of scripture. We've titled the message today, The Steps We Take, and we're looking at Genesis chapters 13 through 22. Our senior minister, Steve, he's been on Genesis chapter 12 for what seems like the last 6 weeks. And then he leaves town and was like, hey, good luck with the next 9, okay? So we're gonna buckle in together. We're just gonna just strap in here, and we're gonna cover a lot of text today. When I was in high school, I remember a time I was on a trip with my youth group, and I grew up in the Valley in Oregon, but my youth pastor grew up over in Joseph, Oregon, in Wallowa County, over kind of in Eastern Oregon. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth. And so we would take a youth group trip over there every year. And one year we went, and he decided we were all going to float this river. And so we went outside of Elgin, Oregon, which is another little kind of dinky town over there in Eastern Oregon. And we were floating, I think it was the Grand Ronde River. And we got down to the place. My youth pastor was like, I used to float here all the time. And it was very apparent as soon as we got there that we were not in the right place because the river was moving so much faster and so much just more swiftly than we were prepared to with our little tire inner tubes that we had. And I remember we got in, he was like, well, there's no way back. We're not turning around. If you want to go back, you can walk. It's 20 miles back to town, or you can get in the river and we can float. And so we did, right? There's 20 of us. And I remember a moment floating down that river where I was being taken towards this whirlpool in the middle of the river. And my youth pastor just looked at me. He's like, just let it take you and it'll shoot you back up eventually. And it did. And I got sucked under, shot up. And we got to the end of the river, and we're all bruised and bloody a little bit, scraped up, just crashed against the rocks all over the place. And we got there, and there was one pickup truck to bring us all back home. And so 20 of us piled into the bed of this truck, kind of all on top of each other, which just, by the way, just if you have kids in our youth group at UCC, I just want you to know this is not how we do youth ministry, okay? But we piled in the back of this truck, and we're going along, and all of a sudden we find ourselves on top of this hill. There's I look down, there's a 150-foot cliff on one side and a herd of sheep on the other, and this farm truck coming on this one-lane road, and we're there's no guardrail, obviously. We're on this old dirt farm road, and we have to back our way down this hill. And I just remember thinking, this is where I'm going to die. I'm never going to see my parents again. This is where it ends. And I remember thinking, how did I end up here, right? How did I get here? Why am I in the back of this beating sun? I'm I don't even know where I am. I'm going to die here. How did I end up here? And the truth is, we ended up there one wrong turn at a time. We weren't supposed to be in any of those locations, actually. We took a series of wrong turns that led us to where we ended up. And maybe you've had situations in your life like that before where you look at it, maybe more serious even, where you look at your life and you think, how did I end up here? What led me here? But the truth is, the same thing leads us to wherever we are every time we get somewhere. It's a series of small steps. Sometimes the right turns, sometimes the wrong turns. But it's always happening one step at a time. And today, we're looking at chapters 13 through 22. Like I said, it's a really big chunk of scripture. But one of the things we're going to look at is we're really just going to compare and contrast the steps that two really primary characters in the book of Genesis take. We're going to look at both Abraham and his nephew Lot. And we're going to see how they really take some small steps in some different directions. And because of that, they end up in two very different locations in their life. And so we're talking about the steps that we take as we look at the steps that Abraham and Lot both took. Now, we've been in this for a little while. If you've been at ECC for a long time, you know that we typically go really slowly. We kind of go verse by verse typically as we pick a book of the Bible. We're not doing that throughout Genesis for the most part. We're really looking at the larger stories that take place within this book. And so that's what we're doing today. So there's going to be some stuff that you might be like, why don't you talk about this or talk about this? But we're really just kind of looking at a really broad overview. Now, in particular, in this section of passages, a lot of people have questions about who Melchizedek is. And so our senior minister, Steve, he actually wrote an article up about who we think that probably is, or some different options about who he is, and just explaining that. So if you have questions about that in particular, we have the article at our Connection Center, or if you tap your phone on one of those tap tags on the back of the seat in front of you, you can find the article there too. But you're not allowed to tap it while I'm talking, okay? You have to do it later, okay? So I want you to know, we're going to talk about the steps Abraham and Lot take. And I also just want to give you this kind of warning. This story, it could look like we're looking at one man as a really good one and one man as a really bad one. But this story about Abraham and Lot is not that. In fact, the stories that we're going to look at really show us that both Abraham and Lot are pretty deeply flawed men. They both make a series of mistakes, some actually very similar kinds of mistakes. But the trajectory with which they take after they make those mistakes determines really where they end up. Those are the steps that they take. And we're going to just compare and contrast the steps they take really post-failure in their life, okay? And so the first step we're going to look at is the step of control. We're going to look at a situation with Abraham and Lot where there's a little bit of a control battle kind of going on here. So just to refresh you, Abraham was called out of the land of Ur. He left Ur of Chaldeans. God called him out of there into the promised land, into Canaan. And so he grabbed his nephew Lot. He took everything he owned. He took his family, and he took Lot with him. And they left their pagan gods behind in Ur, and they come to the land of Canaan. And God gives them this land. And so that's what we're going to take up here in chapter 13. Starting in verse 1. Last week we talked about how Abram was down in Egypt. And by the way, I'm going to say both Abram and Abraham throughout this sermon today because God changes his name from Abram to Abraham. So if you think I'm talking about two different people, I'm talking about the same person. Here's what it says though. Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for the possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. So they have all these things, they have all these animals, they have all these shepherds, they have all these possessions. And what happens is Abram and Lot, they love each other, they can get along, but their shepherds and the people who work for them and their extended families, they start to fight, they start to quarrel. And so Abram looks at Lot and he says, we need to split up. We can't continue to do this together. Everything's all mixed up and it's going to get confusing and people are going to keep fighting. So let's go separate ways. And Abram looks at Lot and he says, if you go right, I'll go left. If you go left, I'll go right. And he takes him up and he says, just choose the land that you want and I'll take whatever is left. And so here's what it says. Lot lifted up his eyes. He saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Like I said, this is kind of the step of control. We see a little bit of a battle for control here, but I want to look first at Lot. And I also want to look at some of the things that we see from Lot and some of these steps that he takes. Now, first of all, it says that Lot lifts up his eyes. As he lifts up his eyes, he saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the Garden of Eden. He looked at it and he said, this is a beautiful place. This is the best land that there is. And there's, I think, a couple of things happening here with Lot. If you back up with me all the way back to the garden, all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, we see really kind of three core sins that happen with Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3. Well, I would call them lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. This is from one of my professors at Bible college. Lust of the flesh is looking at something and saying, I want that, so I'm going to go and I'm going to take it. Lust of the eyes is what Eve did when she looked at the fruit and she said, that looks like it would taste good. I think I like how that looks, and so I'm going to eat it. And the boastful pride of life is saying, I am God. I get to make the choices in my life. I get to do whatever I would like to do. That's what Eve did when she said, I want to know everything that God knows, so I want to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is exactly the same three sins that Lot has here. He looks at the land, he says, this looks like it would be the best land for me. And then he looks at it and he says, this land actually looks pleasing to me. It's green, it's fertile. This would be a good place for me to go. And he says, and I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to choose what's best for me. And he's looking out for number one. We see the boastful pride of life and Lot here. And so he goes down into this valley and he chooses the best land, leaving Abraham with kind of the second best land, leaving him kind of with the leftovers. But the other thing that is significant here for Lot is it tells us that this is Lot's first move really away from God and toward the city of Sodom. So that he took his tents and he went as far as Sodom. He went among the cities of the valley, which the cities of the valley we're going to see in just a moment are all wicked. And he moves his tent as far as Sodom. It said the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. And this is Lot's first little step. It's a step that it might seem insignificant. He just picked the best land. He's just going where things would be best for him and his family, right? But it says that he goes near the city of Sodom. He takes one little step towards them. But it's a step that sets his direction for the rest of his life. It's really where the paths between Abraham and Lot begin to diverge. It's where they really come apart a little bit. Now, with Abraham, we see actually in chapter 12 that he's actually struggling with the same things that Lot is here, with kind of the same sins. In chapter 12, we talked about this last week, where Abram's been given this promise by God, that God said he will make him as numerous as the stars in the sky. His descendants will be more numerous than the sand on the shore, that he will have a great nation, and that really Jesus will come from him. He gives him this promise. But Abraham, he really fails to trust in that promise. Because the next thing Abram does in chapter 12 that we talked about last week is they go down to Egypt because there's this famine. They go down to Egypt, and he offers his wife up to the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh sees Sarai. He sees that she's beautiful, and he says, oh yeah, you can have her. This is just my sister. And Abram, he falls into what I would call the sin of autonomy. He doesn't trust God enough, so he takes matters back into his own hands. He takes control of his life, and he says, I, by my own willpower, am going to make this promise come alive. I'm going to take control of my destiny, and I'm going to figure out what's going to happen to me. So he does that in chapter 12, but what's interesting here in chapter 13 is Abram takes a step. After his failure here in Egypt, he now goes back to the promised land, and when he's in the promised land, he's learned from his failure. And so what we see Abraham do is he lets Lot choose first. And then he just trusts God with the rest. He allows Lot, he says, Lot, I'm going to defer to you. Whatever land you want, I'll take the rest, because he now understands that he doesn't have to be in control, that he can trust God again. Now, what's interesting about Abraham is later you're going to read that he's going to do the exact same thing with his wife again. But for a moment at least, he trusts God with the rest. And because of that, he stays in the land that God had promised to him. He retains this promise that God had given to him. And then he goes, and where he settles, he builds an altar. I think this is significant. It says that he settles by the oaks, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. And this altar was to remind him and everyone else who was with him who God was and what God had promised him and what God had done for them. And so we see these two different stories here in some ways. One, Lot is building on what they can see. Meanwhile, Abram has learned from his own mistakes. He has gotten up and he's taken some steps towards God, and he trusts in and builds on what God has already said. And again, these steps seem small and insignificant, but they aren't, because our steps are what set our direction. They set the direction in which we will go for our lives. So this is the step of control. Now, the next one I think is even more telling for Abram and Lot, and this is the step of formation and what is really forming them and what is really changing them. So with Lot, we see that he's near Sodom, right? They're up on this hill. He picks his land, and it says he moves his tents and his people as far as Sodom. He's near them. He's outside of the city. But what we see with Lot next is that he actually takes another step, and he's now living inside of Sodom. He's living within the city. And if I haven't said this already, Sodom is one of the most wicked, evil, vile cities recorded for us in the entire Bible. It's well regarded as a wicked, evil, sinful city. And so now we see Lot in chapter 14. We see Lot living within the city. There's this battle in the area. All of the cities of the plain, they kind of go into battle with each other. All these kings go to battle. And what it records for us is it says the 4 kings seized all of the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. So just notice that. It's a small step. He picks the right land. He's living near Sodom. Well, now he's living in Sodom. Now he's part of the city. And because of that, he's been carried off. We're going to talk about in a moment how Abram is the one who actually comes and rescues them. He actually sets the whole city free from these kings who have captured them. But notice a lot. He's near Sodom. He's in Sodom. But then if you skip ahead a number of years to chapter 19, we see that Lot is now leading Sodom. Here's what chapter 19 says. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening. This is before God has destroyed the city. They come to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now, that might seem like kind of meaningless. That might seem kind of not harmful. He's just sitting at the city gates. Well, you have to understand that to be at the city gates meant that you were actually a leader. This is where the business leaders, they conducted their business. This is where the city officials, this is where they made decisions and did things. So for Lot to be at the city gate, he wasn't just hanging out there. He was working there. He was leading there. Lot was now leading the city of Sodom, one of the most wicked cities in all of the Bible. The nephew of one of the greats of our faith. He's not just near Sodom, he's not just in Sodom, now he's actually leading Sodom. He's one of the leaders there. And it's these small, seemingly insignificant steps, but they determine our direction. And for Lot, they determine exactly where he's going to end up. Like I said, this city was a wicked place. So I just want to tell you the story a little bit. We're not going to read all of this text because there's so many chapters, so I'm just going to tell you a lot of the story today. It's a genuinely wicked place, probably worse than most things that we even see today. And often, if you know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we often focus on kind of the perversity of the sexual sin of the city because it was. But the sins were beyond that, actually. We see in the book of Ezekiel, the words of God through the prophet Ezekiel, they bring this condemnation down on the city. It says, behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me, so I removed them when I saw it. It was a wicked city, and Lot was one of the ones who was leading it. And so the story goes like this. God goes to Abram, actually. We're going to talk about this again in a moment. We'll come back to it. And he says, I'm going to destroy this city. And Abram kind of pleads with him. He says, well, what if there's some good people? And so God sends some angels down there to kind of scout out the city. And when they arrive at the city, they find Lot. And Lot looks at them and they say, well, we're going to go stay in the city center tonight. We're just going to sleep in the middle of town. It's no big deal. And Lot says, no, you cannot do that. That would not be safe. You can't sleep in the city center. So Lot persuades these angels to come to his house. And this is just kind of gives you the picture of the depravity of the city. So they go with Lot to his house, and they're staying there. And it was custom in that time, if someone came to stay in your house, they were a stranger, they were a foreigner, you would be in charge of protecting them. And so they're in Lot's house, and meanwhile, a group of men, probably a horde, most of the city is kind of what it suggests, they come and they surround Lot's home, and they say, hey, we know that you have 2 guests in there. We've seen them come into your house with you. We want you to send them out, so the Bible says, so that they can know them, which is the Bible's way of saying intercourse. They want Lot to send out these 2 men so they can have their way with these 2 angels. And Lot, this just also gives you a picture of where Lot has gone. Lot, in trying to maybe protect these 2 visitors, I don't know what he's doing or where he's really thinking. He says, no, you can't have them, but why don't you have my 2 youngest daughters? I'll send them out. You can have your way with them. It's no big deal. That is where Lot has gotten to. And eventually the angels, they kind of quiet this crowd and they send them away in kind of a miraculous way if you read the story. But what I want to just hone in on here is that Lot has taken these steps. He's taken the step to be near the city, then to be in the city, and then now he's actually leading the city. And it's led him to a point of destruction where he's willing to offer up his daughters to this angry horde of men. Can you imagine that? And it doesn't happen overnight. It happens one step at a time. But now Lot is fully engrossed in the way of his culture, in the way of his world. And it just happens one step at a time. And we see Lot here again just taking another step towards the path of least resistance. What causes the least amount of friction for himself? Now, meanwhile, Abraham, like I said, he's a flawed human himself. But one of the things we see with Abraham is as it relates to the cities of the plain, which are all pretty wicked, Abraham lives near them, but he really lives apart from them in almost every way. Abram, he is the one in Genesis 14 when Lot is captured with the rest of the city of Sodom. It is Abraham who goes and he rescues his nephew Lot. He returns the king of Sodom back to his place as the king of Sodom. He rescues those people, wicked as they are. He is the one who rescues him. But he wants nothing to do with them. And we see that because he has this conversation with the king of Sodom. It says, the king of Sodom said to Abram after he saved them, the king said, give me all of the people of my city, but take the goods of the city for yourself. He offered him basically all of his wealth, all of his gold. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to God, Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. This is Abram's way of saying, actually, I just saved you because it was the right thing to do, but I want nothing to do with you. I don't want to be any part of you. I don't want any of your things. I don't want to be able to say that you guys gave me anything that I have. I want it to only be from God because I don't want anything to do with you. So we see with Abraham, he's near the city, but he's apart from it. He's close to that culture, but he's not part of it. He's in the world, but he is not of the world. And not only does he save them, but if we go to chapter 18, right before those angels enter into the city of Sodom, we see that Abram is also interceding on their behalf and on behalf of his nephew Lot, who is leading the city. When God goes to Abram, he says, I'm going to destroy the city of Sodom. I'm going to destroy actually a multiple of cities on this plain. And Abram looks at God, he says, God, I know you're a good God. You don't want to do that. What if there's some righteous people? Here's what it says. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous people who are in it? And there's this really funny interaction actually where God says, okay, if there's 50 righteous people in the city, then I'll save it. I won't destroy it. And Abram says, well, okay, that's great. But what if there's only 20? And God says, okay, sure, if there's 20. And Abraham says, well, what if there's only 10? Like, what if there's only 10 righteous people in the city? And God says, okay, fine. And obviously, he doesn't. He doesn't find any righteous people other than Lot, who is considered righteous. We see in 2 Peter, Lot, it seems that he is like torn up by the sin in his own life, and he's distraught by the sin of the culture around him, and he actually does leave. You have to give Lot a little bit of credit. I haven't given him enough credit, but Lot actually does. Originally, he leaves his paganism behind. He leaves his home, and he goes with Abraham into this promised land. And then here, we see that that Lot actually does leave. But I think it's important for us to understand here for a moment that Lot is so shaped by the culture around him. He's so shaped by the world around him. Meanwhile, Abraham is a part of that same area of the world. He sees the wickedness, but he lives apart from it. He's in that world, but he is not of that world. And it's just these little steps that Lot was taking. And it's also these little steps that Abraham was taking towards God. But Lot was taking these little steps away from him back towards the culture of his day. And I think for us, it's so the same. What small steps are you taking every day? It's so easy for us to just take one little step every day. We can take that step towards God. We can take that step towards the world, but no one wakes up one day and decides, I want to ruin my life today. It happens one step at a time. It happens, we start thinking, well, man, don't I deserve that? I deserve it, right? I work really hard at work, and if I take a little extra, who's even going to know? If I just don't work very hard, if I leave, who's even going to notice? It doesn't really matter, does it? I don't really get treated that well at home. I don't really like how my spouse treats me, but I do love how this person treats me, so I'm just going to spend a little more time with them. Right? And then the next thing you know, you're in a full-blown affair. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens one little step at a time. And this is the danger of sin. We allow sin to hang around in our life. Lot does the same exact thing. And when we see this, I think even more clearly as we begin to talk about the step of obedience. I want to look at and compare how both Abram and Lot respond to obedience as they follow God. Now, Lot, he's told to get out of the city. The night before God destroys the city of Sodom, the angels look at Lot and they say, who do you have here with you? They say, who's living here? Go tell your sons-in-law, go tell everyone that you know in your family that God is going to destroy the city and they need to get out. And so he does. He goes to his sons-in-law. He says, it's time for us to leave. God is going to destroy the city. And Lot's witness is so destroyed by this point that he goes to his sons-in-law and says, these angels have told me this, that they laugh at him. His sons-in-law, they laugh at him. They say, whatever, you're just joking. There's no way that that's true. And so Lot goes back to sleep that night. And then the next morning, here's what's recorded for us. And we really see Lot's obedience here, or disobedience. It says, as morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. And I think verse 16 is so key. It says, but he lingered. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out of the city and set him outside of the city. Verse 16 again, but he lingered. He waited. Lot thought that he could just kind of play with his sin. He thought he could keep it around because he wanted it. But sin doesn't work that way. Sin wants to destroy you. It wanted to destroy Lot, and it is only by the mercy of God that he was rescued from this city. Because Lot lingered. If you back up all the way to Genesis chapter 4, there's the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain kills his brother. And God speaks to Cain, and he describes sin to Cain. He says, Cain, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you. Sin wants to destroy your life, and it will. if we linger, if we let sin hang around, if we just play with it, it will destroy us. And while Lot is credited as righteous, while Lot is saved, think of all of the destruction and chaos that Lot welcomed into his own life by all those little steps that he took every day away from God. Think about how much it destroyed his life. And it's not just that he lingered, but once he gets out of the city, he then begins to negotiate his obedience. The angels tell him, they say, Lot, you need to flee to the hills. Go be with Abram. Go run to him and go be with him again. And here's what Lot says as he negotiates his obedience. Oh no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. He says, behold, this city, over here it's the city of Zoar. He says, behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved. Notice that. The angels say, you need to go from the cities of the plain. They're evil and wicked. You should not be in these cities. You need to go back to the hills and go be with Abraham. And he negotiates. He says, it's just a little city. And now, meanwhile, Zoar was an ally of the city of Sodom, certainly not unfamiliar with their wickedness, probably partnering it as well. But he says, is it not a little one? It's just a little one. It's no big deal, is it? But it is. Because it is the very same thing that has destroyed Lot's life. Now, again, I got to give him credit because he does leave. He doesn't look back like his wife did when she turns to a pillar of salt, but he leaves. Now, it's because God was merciful and drug him out of the city, but he still does it. Now, with Abraham and Lot, when it comes to obedience, we see actually a similar sin pattern, but a very different response, a very different trajectory in the face of their sin. Abram, if you look at chapters 16 and 17, we see the story where God has made his covenant with him in Genesis 15, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But he's made this covenant with him, and Abram again tries to take things into his own hands. He's struggling again, I think, with the sin of autonomy. He's like, I'm old, my wife is old, she's never had a child. How am I going to have descendants more numerous than the stars in the sky if I don't even have kids? And so his wife, Sarai, comes to him and she says, I have a plan. I can't have kids, but you can go have a child with my servant Hagar. And so he does. And as Hagar becomes pregnant, Sarai gets angry at her. And there's this really beautiful story, actually, if you go and read it, where Hagar has to flee because Sarah is angry at her. And she actually meets with God. And she talks about how God is the God who sees her, that this uncared about, cast aside servant woman Hagar, who's been impregnated by her like the one she serves husband. She says, God is the God who sees me. This is beautiful story where God does this. And so there's all kinds of sin. There's all kinds of disobedience here with Abram, but he comes back around. And in chapter 17, God comes back to Abraham and he says, Abraham, remember what I promised you. He says, do you remember the promise I've given you? I've made this covenant with you just a little bit ago. I'm going to come through with it. And he gives him this command to circumcise everyone in his house. All of the men in his house need to be circumcised. And so I want you to just notice here what he does in his obedience here. It says Abram was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and Ishmael was 13 years old. It says that very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. That very day. He didn't linger. He didn't wait. He didn't negotiate. Abram said, that very day, we're going to be obedient, and we are going to do this. And so again, you see this, two very flawed men, two very different immediate responses in two very different directions. Abraham is just as flawed as Lot, but he takes steps towards God rather than stepping towards the rest of the world. And because of that, they end up in two very different locations. And while I got to give Abraham credit here, I think that one of the things that he understands that maybe Lot didn't is Abram's actions were all rooted in the promises of God. That God made this promise to Abraham in chapter 12 that he would be a large and mighty and powerful nation. And then in Genesis chapter 15, he makes this covenant with him. And I think that Abram was able to be obedient because it was rooted in what God had done for him. It was rooted in what God had said to him, not necessarily in how committed Abraham was to God, but in how committed God was to Abraham. And so I want to just tell you, Genesis chapter 15, God makes the covenant with Abraham in this chapter. And the way that people would make covenants are like contracts. The way people would make a covenant with each other in those days, it was common. They would take a set of animals and they would cut them in half and they would kind of make a trail or like a path. And either the lesser party or both parties together would walk through that path of dead animals as if to say, if I break my end of the bargain, if I don't follow through on my end of the covenant, then what happened to these animals can happen to me. And so what happens in Genesis 15 is Abraham goes and he makes this path of dead animals, and then actually God puts him into this deep sleep. And while Abraham is in this deep sleep, he has this vision of God alone walking through this path of dead animals. It's as if God is saying to Abraham, let this be done to me if I don't fulfill my promise to you. And so I think all of Abraham's actions, the way that he can be obedient to God, the way that he can get up and take steps towards God rather than towards his own sin, are born out of this covenant that God makes with him and this promise that comes all the way back from Genesis 12 and this covenant here in Genesis 15. So it isn't that he's better than Lot. In fact, again, I think he makes almost just as many mistakes along the way, but Abram knows the promises of God, and because of that, he's able to step towards him every time he fails. And Abram knows that it's not just about how committed he is to God, it's really about how committed God is to him. And we struggle with this, I think, sometimes too, even with our understanding of the gospel. I think often we could read a story like this, or we read the Bible and we think, well, the moral of the story is for me that if I'm committed enough, then God will come through for me. If I can just be good enough, if I can just be committed enough, if I can really commit myself to God, then God will commit himself to me. But that's not really the moral of the story. In fact, one of the things we see in the story is that God is committed to Lot, even though Lot continually is not really that committed to him, especially in comparison to Abraham. The main point isn't for us to just be less like Lot and be more like Abraham, although that is part of the story that we have to learn from here today. The main point of this story is really the idea that God is committed to Abraham, and in the same way, God is committed to you. He's committed himself to you through the cross of Jesus. So it's not be committed enough and then God will come through for you. It's actually God has bound himself to you. Therefore, you can actually live differently. You can actually have new life. You can actually live differently in your life and act in obedience to God and live out the life you were created for because God first acted through Jesus on the cross, because he has committed himself to us. And that's exactly why we see the difference in Abraham and Lot as we compare their lives. You see, Lot, he is driven by sight, he's shaped by culture, he's marked by hesitation, but Abraham, who knows the promises of God, he's rooted in God's promise, he's formed by his presence, and he is marked by obedience. And so the reality is that you have to understand is your life with God doesn't flow out of just how committed you are to him. It really ultimately flows out of his unbreakable commitment to you. And when you begin to understand that, that is when you can learn to live a life that looks a little bit more like Abraham. You can really learn to live a life of radical obedience. You see, Lot, he was building a life for himself based on all the things that he wanted and saw and he thought were good. But Abraham was trying to live out the life that God had already promised him because he knew the commitment that God had to him. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, I'm certainly not Abraham. I'm not the father of our faith. That's not who I am. And God has never walked through a trail of dead animals for me, right? So what is this covenant actually for? Is it really actually for you? Well, I want you to know it is. Because in Genesis 15, God essentially says to Abraham, if I fail you, may I be torn apart. And it is at the cross of Jesus that he ultimately keeps that promise. And it's not just a promise that's for Abraham, it's a promise that he gives to you too, that if you will go to the cross, that he has put his own son on in your place, that he will offer you new life, that he will offer you the transformation that you so desperately know that you need. The transformation that we try to find out in the world, that we take little steps towards all the time, but that we will not find there. We can only find it in the cross of Jesus Christ, and that is where our hope resides. It's in the cross. And it's in his promise. This promise he made to Abraham is a promise for us too. The book of Hebrews talks about this. The author in chapter 6, he talks about the covenant that God makes with Abraham and how that applies to us as well. And here's what he says. He says, we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf. This is a sure and steadfast anchor of our soul, that we have hope in Jesus Christ because God has committed himself to us through him. there is hope in life. We can live lives of radical obedience like Abraham did because we know of the commitment God has made to us. And our response is simply to put our faith in him and to allow him to make us new. It doesn't mean like we have to now clean ourselves up and we have to be perfect. We have to make everything good. In fact, Romans 12, Paul tells us, he says, offer yourselves as a spiritual sacrifice. That's our job. It's simply to offer ourselves back to God to allow him to transform us. And that is the distinct difference between Abram and Lot. While Lot is still considered righteous, Lot over and over and over offers himself to the wrong things. He offers himself up to the way of the world, to the culture around him, and it destroys him. Meanwhile, Abraham fails, he sins, he struggles, and he gets up and he offers himself back to God. And because of that, we see two totally different directions and two totally different locations. And so my question for you today that I want to leave you with is simply this. What steps are you taking? Where are your steps taking you? Are you becoming more like Abraham every day? Or are you taking the same steps that Lot did? Now, I want you to know if you are over here thinking like, I'm way too much like Lot, I want you to know you're never too far gone. Lot wasn't. God was merciful to him and saved him, and God can do the same for you if you let him. But what steps are you taking today? Because the reality is your relationship with God, it's formed one step at a time. It's formed one step at a time. So where are you headed? Where are you going? If your relationship with God is formed one step at a time, where are your steps taking you? Let's pray. God, we love you. And God, I'm so grateful that you form our steps, that you invite us into a new way of life. And so God, let us live our lives with radical obedience, taking steps towards you, taking steps away from the culture of our world, and taking steps towards you so that we can find true, real, lasting life. God, thank you for saving us. Thank you for your grace and your mercy and your kindness to us. Let us step with you this week. And we pray this in your name. Amen.